People across the valley watched her, and they shook their heads. It was the summer of 1883 in the high country outside Harlan's Crossing, Montana Territory, and a widow named Nora Calder was doing something that made no earthly sense. She was planting sunflowers. Hundreds of them. Not in a kitchen garden. Not along a fence line where a woman might grow something bright to soften a hard life. She was planting them in a thick, continuous ring, 8 feet wide and nearly 40 feet long, flush against the north and west walls of her cabin. From the road, the whole enterprise looked like something a woman did when grief had loosened her sense. The cabin itself was modest. One main room, a small lean-to for the goat, a root cellar cut into the slope behind. Nora Calder had lived there alone since the spring of 1881, when her husband Thomas had died of a lung fever in January, not 3 days after the last of their firewood ran out. He had gone out in the cold to split more. He did not come back the same man. He came back with ice in his chest, and the ice never left. They had 2 cords of wood, and it had not been enough, and she had sat beside him in that freezing room and watched the candle flame shudder, and watched him shudder, and knew exactly what the cold could do when it decided it wanted what you had. She had been planting sunflowers in a ring against her cabin walls for 3 months, when the summer of 1883 gave way to August. And the question the whole valley was asking, the question nobody could quite answer, was why. If you want to know what those flowers were really for, if you want to know what Nora Calder understood about winter that the rest of that valley had never learned, stay with this, because the blizzard was coming, and when it came, it would answer every question anyone in Harlan's Crossing had ever thought to ask about a grieving woman and her flowers. Would those sunflowers keep her alive, or would she die in that cabin the same way Thomas did? Stay right here, and we'll find out together. The talk started in June, when the first seeds went in. Harlan's Crossing was a small community, the kind where a person's business was everyone's business by noon, and everyone's entertainment by supper. There were maybe 200 souls in the valley proper, and another 40 or 50 scattered on homesteads above the tree line. They knew each other the way people know each other, when there is no other option. They knew each other's failures and sorrows and habits, and they talked. Eli Greer talked first. He ran the feed and supply at the crossroads, a barrel-chested man with a red beard who had opinions on everything, and kept most of them. He saw Nora Calder loading a second sack of sunflower seeds into her wagon one Thursday morning, and he said, loudly enough for the men on the porch to hear, that the widow had gone soft in the head, that grief did things to a person, that a woman alone on 40 acres was no different from a ship without a rudder. She'd drift wherever the wind pushed her, and right now the wind was pushing her toward flowers. Pete Solvang, who ran cattle on the South Bench, laughed and said she was building herself a garden wall, a flower fortress. Said she probably figured sunflowers were stout enough to hold back a Montana winter. Said it the way men say things when they want the laughter to carry. It carried. By July, the phrase had stuck. They called it the flower fortress. Sometimes they shortened it to the fortress. Sometimes, when they were feeling less charitable, they called it the widow's folly. Nora heard it. She heard everything. She was not deaf, and Harlan's Crossing was not large. She heard it, and she kept planting. She had a dog named Rue, a brindled cattle dog, short-haired and serious, with one ear that stood straight and one that folded over at the tip. Rue went everywhere Nora went. When Nora knelt in the dirt to press seeds into the earth, Rue sat 3 feet away and watched the road. When Nora hauled water in 2-gallon buckets from the creek, 30, 40 trips a day through that dry July, Rue walked beside her. The dog did not appear to share the valley's amusement. Nora Calder planted and watered and did not explain herself. Not once. Her silence was its own kind of answer. Though nobody in Harlan's Crossing was yet equipped to understand what the answer meant. She had learned it from her father's brother, a man named Caspar Vane, who had spent 14 winters on the northern plains before he came south to help raise her when her mother died. Caspar was not a soft man, and he was not a talkative one. But he had a particular quality that Nora had recognized even as a girl. He paid attention to things that other people had already decided were not worth attention. He had studied how the Lakota built their winter camps, not just where they put them, in the bends of rivers, in the low draws where cottonwoods grew. But why? He had noticed how the camps were always ringed, to the north and to the west, by natural growth, by willow stands and old brush, and anything that broke the wind before the wind reached the fire. He had noticed that a fire inside a ring of brush put out the same heat as a fire in open air, but the air inside that ring was different. Quieter, slower, warmer in a way that the thermometer almost couldn't measure, but that your skin measured perfectly. He told Nora when she was 12 years old and they were sitting beside a stove in a cold November, still air is the warmest thing in the world. Moving air kills. Everything the cold does to you, it does through moving air. Give the wind something else to find first, and the cold has to come to you the long way around. She had never forgotten it. She had thought about it every January of her life. She had thought about it sitting beside Thomas in that freezing room, listening to him breathe, and knowing that the cold had come through the walls without any resistance at all. Still air is the warmest thing in the world. She was not planting sunflowers for beauty. She was planting them for their stalks. Dry sunflower stalks, packed dense, trap more still air per square foot than almost anything a frontier woman could lay hands on for free. Her father's brother had told her that. He had seen it done. He had lived through winters that should have killed him, sleeping beside fires that should not have been warm enough, because the wind never reached him, because something was always between him and the wind. She planted her flowers. She watered them through July. And when August came, she was already thinking about September. The man who came to speak with her in the last week of August was named Carroll Marsh, and he was as close to an authority as Harlan's Crossing had. He had built more cabins in that valley than any other man alive. He had built them in summer, and he had built them in blizzards, and he had patched the ones that failed and buried the men that the failed ones killed. He was 61 years old, and his hands showed it. He came to Nora on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, and he sat on her porch steps and he told her plainly what he was worried about. He was not unkind about it. That was the thing about Carroll Marsh. He was never unkind. He told her that sunflower stalks were porous, and porous things wicked moisture, and moisture against a cabin wall in a Montana winter was a death sentence for the wood. He told her that rodents liked dense plantings, that mice and voles would set up housekeeping inside her flower wall before the first snow fell, and by February she would have a rodent problem that would outlast the winter by 3 years. He told her that wet, compressed organic matter generated a cold of its own, a damp cold that was harder on a body than dry air. These were not foolish objections. Every one of them had a seed of truth in it. Carroll Marsh had watched enough things fail in enough winters to know what failure looked like, and what he saw against Nora Calder's cabin wall looked like failure to him. She listened to all of it. She let him finish. And then she told him that she had thought about every one of those things, and that she had an answer for each of them, and she would show him in the spring what the answers looked like, if he cared to come back and see. He thanked her. He stood up and put his hat back on and walked to his horse and rode back down the road toward town. He was not convinced, but he was not unkind, and he was not entirely comfortable with his own certainty either, and that discomfort would stay with him until December, which was when it would matter. By August, the sunflowers were chest-high. By September, the tallest of them cleared 6 feet, with heads wide as dinner plates and stalks thick as a man's thumb. There were 260 plants in the ring on the north and west walls, spaced close, growing so dense that you could not push your arm through them at shoulder height. From the road, it looked like a fortress of yellow and green, chaotic, vivid, nothing like a proper homestead. From inside, it looked like warmth. Nora had planned the harvest as carefully as she had planned the planting. She let the heads dry on the stalk until the seeds were firm and the stalks had begun to harden. Then, across 10 days in late September and early October, she cut them. She used a short-handled sickle that had been Thomas's, and she cut each stalk close to the ground and carried them in armloads to the north side of the cabin wall. She had built a simple frame there, rough cut boards, no more than a foot off the ground, running the full 40 feet of the north and west exposure. The frame made a channel, a sleeve of open space between the cabin wall proper and the outside air. Into that sleeve she packed the dried stalks, vertically, so they stood upright and close, the way books stand on a shelf. The channel was 8 inches deep. The stalks filled it floor to ceiling, with 10,000 small chambers of still, dry air. On the outside of the stalks she nailed a second skin, rough boards again, spaced with 1/4-inch gaps to let the wall breathe but tight enough to hold the stalks in place and shield them from direct weather. She chinked the top with clay and river moss, She ran a thin bead of tallow along the bottom where the frame met the ground. It took her 11 days. Her hands blistered on day 3 and cracked on day 7 and bled a little on day 9. Rue lay in the dirt beside her each evening while she rubbed goose fat into her palms and looked at what she had built. The cabin wall behind the stalks was dry to the touch. That mattered. The stalks themselves were dry. She had made certain of it, turning them in the sun for 2 full weeks before packing them in, checking each one for soft spots that meant moisture. She had refused every stalk that was not absolutely certain. Still, air is the warmest thing in the world. The wall was full of it. The first sign that something was wrong came in mid-October. 3 weeks after she finished packing the stalks, she noticed, one cold morning, that the bottom 6 inches of the wall on the northeast corner had gone damp to the touch. Not wet, but soft, in a way that dry wood is not soft. She pressed her thumb against the board and felt it yield just slightly, and she knew immediately what had happened. Ground moisture. The frame sat directly on the soil, and even with the tallow seal, the autumn rains had saturated the ground beneath it, and the bottom of the stalk channel was drawing that moisture upward. The stalks near the base of that corner were no longer fully dry. She did not panic. She had half expected something to go wrong. Had known that a first attempt on a 40-foot wall was unlikely to be perfect. She pulled the outer boards off the northeast corner, removed the bottom 2 feet of stalks, and let the remaining stalks dry in the October air for 3 days. Then she dug a shallow trench along the base of the frame, filled it with gravel, and laid flat stones as a capstone between the soil and the frame. She repacked the bottom of the channel with fresh, dry stalks she had kept as reserve. She replaced the outer boards, rechinked and retallowed. It cost her 4 days. But when she pressed her thumb against that corner again on a frost-cold morning in late October, the board was firm. The moisture had no path upward. The wall was dry all the way to the ground. She stood back and looked at the whole north face of the cabin. 40 feet of double-skinned, stalk-packed wall, gravel-footed, clay-chinked, goose tallow sealed, standing between her and whatever the winter chose to send. Still air is the warmest thing in the world. She had built a house full of it. By the end of October, the days had gone short and grey, and the temperature on the high benchland above Harlan's Crossing was dropping 10 degrees below what it had been the October before. The old men in town noticed it. The cattlemen noticed it. There was talk of a hard winter, the way there is always talk of a hard winter, and usually the talk is wrong. This time the talk was quiet and specific in a way that made people who had been around long enough pay attention. Carroll Marsh noticed it. He had lived through the winter of 1880 and the winter of 1875, and one winter in the Bitterroot Range that he did not speak of by name, and he knew the particular quality of October air that preceded a killing winter. It was not the temperature alone. It was the stillness between the cold snaps, the silence of it, the way the sky turned a particular shade of pewter in the northwest that told a man the storm was building somewhere far away, still gathering, not yet ready to come. He thought about Nora Calder's flower wall. He thought about it more than he wanted to. Rue felt it first. The dog had slept for 2 years in a particular spot just inside the cabin door, on a folded piece of canvas that Nora had set there for her. But in the last week of October, Rue stopped sleeping there. She moved her sleeping to the back of the cabin, the south wall, as far from the north exposure as she could get inside the small space. She lay there in the evenings and watched the north wall with her ears forward. A dog does not flatter a wall. If the wall had been cold, if the stalks were failing, if the still air was escaping, Rue would have known it. Nora watched her dog and drew her own conclusions. On the 3rd of November, the geese went over. Not a few. Thousands of them, in long broken skeins, moving south with a speed and urgency that Nora had not seen in the fall migrations of the previous 2 years. They did not circle. They did not pause on the lower pond the way they usually did. They went straight and fast, and they did not look down. On the 5th of November, the wind died. Not dropped. Died. The air went absolutely still. The kind of still that is not peace but suspension, as if something enormous was drawing a breath before it spoke. The temperature was 11 degrees above zero. The sky was clear and very pale, almost white at the horizon to the north. Nothing moved. The creek sounded loud in the silence, because everything else had stopped. Nora Calder stood on her porch in that dead still air and understood what was coming. She went inside and she stoked the fire to its maximum and filled every pot and bucket she had with water from the creek and brought in the goat and made sure the root cellar latch was tight and checked. One final time, every foot of the stalk wall on the outside, pressing her palms flat against the boards and feeling for any softness, any moisture, any weakness. There was none. She went inside and she sat by the fire and she waited. The storm had no official name in the territory records. What it had was numbers. It arrived before dawn on the 7th of November, 1883, and in the first 6 hours it dropped 14 inches of snow on the valley floor and 22 on the benchland above. The wind came with it from the northwest, running at 30 to 40 miles an hour in the valley and gusting to something that broke the cups off the anemometer at the surveyor's station before anyone thought to take a final reading. The temperature fell through the floor of 0 and kept going. By noon on the 7th, it was 22 below. By midnight, on the 8th, it was 31 below. 3 ranchers on the high bench recorded it at 37 below 0 in the early hours of the 9th, which was when the worst of it passed. Old-timers who lived through it called it the Black November. In the county records, it was simply the storm of November 1883. It killed 11 cattle, 4 horses, 2 men, and a great many illusions about what a Montana winter could bring when it decided to bring everything. The snow piled against every wall in the valley. It found every gap, every chinked joint, every board that had gone soft with age or moisture. In the cabins with thin walls, the cold came through the walls themselves, not through holes, but through the wood, through the very substance of the structure, because wood alone is not enough when the air on the other side of it is 30 degrees below 0. The cold went where the cold could go. It was patient and impartial, and it did not negotiate its verdicts. In 2 of the cabins on the main road, the fires went out in the night, not because the wood ran out, but because the drafts were so severe that the stoves couldn't hold temperature. The air was moving too fast through the rooms, pulling the heat out as fast as the fire could make it. The families in those cabins spent the worst of the storm under every blanket and coat they owned and counted the hours. Nora Calder's fire held steady. The stalk wall did what still air does when you give it enough of it. It stayed warm. On the interior of the cabin wall, behind the 8 inches of packed stalks, the wood was never more than a few degrees below the interior temperature. The cold had to pass through still air to get to that wall, and still air gives the cold almost nothing to work with. The cold went looking for a faster path, and found none on the north or west sides of that cabin. On the night of the 8th, 18 hours into the worst of it, Nora put on every layer she owned and went outside. It was not a choice she made lightly. The wind was blinding, the snow was horizontal. She could not see the north wall of her own cabin from the south porch. She could barely see her hand at arm's length. The cold hit the exposed skin of her face like a board, and she gasped and pressed her scarf up over her nose and made herself breathe slowly and deliberately through the wool. She had gone out because she needed to check the top of the stalk wall. She had a fear that she had not spoken aloud to anyone. A fear that the accumulated weight of the snow on the clay and moss chinking at the top of the wall might crack it. If the chinking cracked, the snow would find the channel beneath it, and wet snow packed into a stalk wall overnight at 30 below was the end of everything. She moved along the cabin wall with one hand on the boards, feeling her way, her feet disappearing to the ankle in every step. The wind hit the north face of the stalk wall, and she felt it buffet her, but she felt something else too. She felt the still pocket of air that existed on the inside of that wall, in the foot of space between the outer boards and the cabin proper. It was not warm, but it was vastly warmer than the open air 3 feet away, and it was absolutely without wind. She reached the northeast corner. She pressed herself against the wall and used both hands to feel along the top chinking from the corner westward. The clay was hard, frozen solid. She felt 3 small cracks in the first 8 feet. Not breaks, not gaps, but stress cracks, spider web lines in the frozen surface. She pressed her thumbs into each one, gauging the depth. None of them went through. None of them opened to the stalk channel beneath. She kept moving west along the top of the wall, checking every 2 feet. At the 22-foot mark, she found what she had feared. A crack ran 6 inches along the clay, and it had depth to it. She could push the tip of her thumbnail into it and feel the gap below. The snow was already finding it. She had to fix it. In the middle of the night. In the worst blizzard in 2 years. At 31 degrees below zero, she had brought a rag soaked in tallow and a short length of rope tied around her waist, the other end fixed to the porch post, so she could find her way back in a whiteout. She pressed the tallow rag into the crack with her thumbs, working it deep, sealing it as well as she could in the dark and the wind and the cold that was working on her fingers even through her wool gloves. She worked for 11 minutes. She counted, because counting kept her mind on the task and off the fear. At one point the wind gusted so hard it drove her sideways, and she lost contact with the wall. She pulled the rope taut and walked it back. She found the wall again, and she finished the ceiling, and she pressed the tallow down with both palms until her palms went numb. Then she followed the rope back to the porch door and went inside and stood by the fire and shook for 15 minutes without stopping. She was alive. The wall was sealed. The still air was still. A dog does not flatter a wall, and when Nora came back through the door, soaked and shaking, Rue got up from the south wall corner and walked to her and pressed against her legs, and that was the warmest thing that happened on the night of November 8th in Harlan's Crossing, Montana. The storm broke before dawn on the 9th. The wind died first. Then the snow thinned and stopped. The sky cleared from the west. By 10 in the morning the sun was out, brilliant and cold and pitiless, on a landscape that had been rearranged entirely. There were drifts 6 feet tall in places. The road through the valley was gone. The fences were buried. The creek was silent under 2 feet of ice. The temperature at 10 in the morning was 29 below zero. Inside Nora Calder's cabin, the thermometer on the interior wall read 44 degrees above zero. That is not warm by any measure a comfortable person would accept. But it was 73 degrees warmer than the air outside, and she had burned no more wood than a normal November night would have required, and the fire had never faltered. And she had water in her pots, and food in her cellar, and a goat in the lean-to, and a dog at her feet, and she was alive and unharmed, and her hands had stopped shaking. She took the exterior thermometer from its hook beside the porch door, and held it alongside the interior one, and looked at the two readings together. 29 below, 44 above. She held them there for a long moment. Still air is the warmest thing in the world. Her father's brother had said it to her when she was 12 years old, and she had carried it for 26 years, and here was the proof of it, in mercury and glass, on a day so cold that the sap in the fence posts had split the wood from the inside. She set both thermometers on the table. She put the kettle on. She fed Rue. Carol Marsh came 2 days later, when the road was passable enough for a horse. He came alone, without any pretense of business, and he stood on the porch of Nora Calder's cabin, and he asked if he might look at the wall. She took him around to the north face. He looked at it, for a long time. He ran his hands along the boards the way a carpenter runs his hands along boards. Not quickly, not to make a show, but slowly, reading the surface the way a man reads a page. He pressed his palm flat in the place where the chinking had cracked, and found the tallow-patched repair, and held his hand there for 10 seconds. The boards behind his palm were not cold. They were not warm. They were something between. Something that a wall with 31 below zero on the other side of it had no right to be. He pressed his palm to the unprotected east wall of the cabin, the wall with no stalk layer, and his jaw tightened at the difference. He stood there for a while with his hand on the east wall. Then he turned to Nora Calder, and he said, simply, "I was wrong." 3 words. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize at length or qualify. He said, "I was wrong," and the cold and the silence of that morning made it land with the weight it deserved. She nodded once. She said, "The stalks need to come out in the spring before the moisture comes back. I'll replant in May." He said, "I'd like to see how you do the gravel footing." She showed him. The knock on her door came on the night of the 9th, 2 days before Carol Marsh, while the temperature was still sliding back toward the floor of zero, and the world outside was dark and absolute. She heard it just after 8 o'clock. A thin knock. Not strong. She opened the door and found Pete Solvang standing in the snow, which was past his knees, with his wife Margaret at his arm, and their youngest girl, who was 6 years old, pressed between them. The child was not crying. She was past crying, pale and very still, with that particular stillness that cold makes in a child when the cold has been going on for a long time. Behind Pete was Eli Greer, the man who had spoken first about the Flower Fortress, the man who had said the widow had gone soft in the head. He did not speak when the door opened. He looked at Nora Calder, and he looked at the lamplight behind her and the fire she'd built up in the last hour, and the warmth that was coming out of the open door, even in that cold. And he did not say a word. Nora stepped back from the door. She said, "Come in." No more than that. No speech, no account of what she had built, or what they had said, or what the night of the 8th had cost her. She said come in, and she meant it completely, and they came in. The Solvangs and Eli Greer, and, behind him, a woman Nora only half recognized from the far end of the valley, a Mrs. Aldrin, who had walked 3/4 of a mile through the post-storm drifts with a baby wrapped in everything she owned. Nora made room. She made tea. She put the Solvang girl as close to the fire as she could get her without burning her, and she watched the child's colour come back, which took 20 minutes, and she watched it in silence, and so did everyone else in that small warm room. She had 7 people in a one-room cabin that night, and the fire held, and the wall held, and by morning everyone was alive, and the temperature outside had risen to 14 below, which in the valley they called an improvement. Eli Greer left without saying anything of substance. At the door, when he was going, he stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back into the room, at the warmth, at the people who were still there, at Nora Calder who was already stoking the fire for the morning, and he said, "I should have listened." She did not respond to that. She was thinking about the fire. By the spring of 1884, 3 neighbouring homesteaders had come to Nora Calder to ask about the wall. She showed each of them what she had done. She explained the gravel footing and the vertical packing, and the importance of letting the stalks cure for 2 full weeks before they went into the channel. She told them what her father's uncle had told her. Still, air is the warmest thing in the world. Moving air kills. Give the wind something else to find first. Carol Marsh came back in April and spent a full morning examining the wall, now that the stalks had been removed for the season, checking the cabin wood beneath for any rot or moisture damage. There was none. The wood was as sound as the day it was cut. He stood looking at the exposed boards for a long time, and then he said, quietly, that he had built 34 cabins in that valley, and this was the first time he had ever seen the north wall of a Montana cabin come through a winter without a single soft board. He helped Nora rebuild the frame that May, after the new planting went in. By the summer of 1885, 7 homesteads in the valley had the rings of sunflowers growing against their north and west walls. By 1886, it was 11. The newcomers who arrived in 87 were told about it at the supply store, which was now run by a younger man who had bought it from Eli Greer when Greer moved his family south. The newcomers were told to talk to Nora Calder, that she would show them. The valley had its own name for it by then. Nobody called it the Widow's Folly. Nobody called it the Flower Fortress. They called it the Calder Wall. Sometimes, in the way these things go, they called it simply the Nora, as in, do you have a Nora up yet? Or we put a Nora on the north face last summer. Changed everything. The idea outlived the argument. That is how it always goes, when the idea is right. Thomas Calder had died in a cold cabin in January 1881, because the cold had come in through the walls without any resistance at all. Nora had sat beside him and felt the air moving even in a closed room. The cold drafts that travelled along the floor, the heat leaving through the ceiling, the fire working as hard as it could, and the cold working harder. She had sat there and learned, the way a person learns things that cost them everything, what cold really was. Not a temperature, a movement, a force that travelled on air, that could only be stopped by air. By still air. By air that had nowhere to go. She had done the one thing the valley had decided was foolish. She had built a wall of frozen sunlight, of stored August, of dried summer, of all that growing season packed into stalks and still air and careful work. And the winter had come with everything it had, and the wall had answered it, and the numbers on 2 thermometers had said what needed to be said, more clearly than any argument ever could. The strongest protection is not always the one that looks the strongest. The thing that looks fragile, a ring of sunflower stalks, a widow's planting, A dead man's memory can hold more warmth than 4 inches of cut timber if it understands what warmth really is and where it lives. She had known that. She had known it because someone who paid attention had told her, and she had been wise enough to listen and stubborn enough to act. Still air is the warmest thing in the world. Nora Calder had built a house full of it, and when the black November came down from the north like a verdict, she had been ready, and the people who laughed at her had not been, and she had taken them in anyway, without a word about any of it, because that is what competence and grace look like when they live in the same person. Rue lived another 4 winters in that cabin, sleeping on the south wall when the cold was coming, and at the door when it was not. A dog does not flatter a wall, and the wall, all those winters, gave the dog nothing to worry about. So here is the question this valley leaves you with. It is not a complicated question, but it is an honest one. If you had stood on the road outside Harlan's Crossing in the summer of 1883 and watched a grieving woman press sunflower seeds into the dirt in a ring around her cabin walls, would you have laughed, or would you have been one of the few willing to stop and wonder and ask what she knew that you didn't? Leave your answer in the comments, because the answer says something about who you are when winter comes.